The courtroom was packed with the faint hum of whispers, the shuffling of papers, the impatient tap of a gavel against wood as the bailiff called the case, and Ava Lennox sat at the defendant's table trying to keep her hands from shaking while the fluorescent lights made the bruises under her eyes look darker than they were. She was dressed in the same layered sweater and patched jeans she'd worn when the police pulled her from the alley 3 nights ago. The same faded backpack at her feet that held everything she owned. And every time she glanced toward the gallery, she caught the disapproving stares of strangers who had no idea who she was or what had brought her here. The prosecutor, a clean-cut man with a tie the color of midnight, launched into the charges: trespassing, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, as if reciting them would erase the fact that she'd been sleeping behind the library only because the shelter was full and the snow had started falling before she could find a bus stop. But his voice blurred into the background as she watched the judge lean forward in his seat. Judge Carter Ellison was known for his measured demeanor, his deep voice carrying the weight of decades in law. And yet as his eyes scanned the brief in front of him, something shifted in his expression. A crease between his brows, a pause that stretched long enough to make the court reporter glance up. "Ms. Lennox," he said slowly, and the sound of her name spoken without accusation startled her. "Do you have legal representation?" She shook her head because the public defender had been late that morning and hadn't even met her before the hearing. And for a moment, the judge just looked at her, not like a defendant, not like a case file, but like a person who had been failed in 100 ways before ever setting foot in this room. He glanced toward the prosecutor, then back at Ava, and in one fluid motion that broke every unspoken rule of distance, he set down his pen, pushed back his chair, and stood, the scrape of wood on tile echoing louder than the murmur that rose from the gallery. The bailiff shifted, unsure whether to intervene, but Judge Ellison descended the 2 shallow steps from the bench, walked past the clerk's desk, and crossed the room toward her as if the trial itself could wait. Ava's heart pounded. She wasn't sure if she should stand or stay seated, but then he stopped at the table, extended his hand. Not for a shake, but palm up, open, an unspoken invitation. She hesitated. The eyes of every juror, every spectator, every uniform in the room fixed on her, and then she placed her trembling fingers in his. His hand was warm, steady, and when he closed it gently around hers, the clamor in her head quieted for the first time in days. "We're going to slow this down," he said, voice pitched low enough for only her and the court stenographer to hear, though the room had fallen so still it seemed even the air was listening. "You deserve to be heard before you're judged." The words didn't erase the weight on her shoulders, but they shifted it just enough for her to breathe. Somewhere behind them, the prosecutor cleared his throat. The bailiff muttered into his radio, and a camera shutter clicked. Whether from a reporter or someone's phone, she couldn't tell. But none of it mattered in that moment. All she knew was that the man who held the authority to decide her fate had, in front of everyone, stepped out from behind the wall of formality to meet her where she sat. "Bailiff," the judge said without releasing her hand, "this case is going to recess. Ms. Lennox will be provided counsel before we proceed any further." There was a rustle of objection from the prosecutor, but the judge silenced it with a glance, turning his attention back to Ava with a subtle nod that told her this wasn't pity. It was a choice. When he finally let go, the warmth lingered in her fingers, and as he walked back to the bench, a quiet understanding passed between them that whatever came next, she wasn't entirely alone anymore. Ava sat straighter, the chains of humiliation loosening just enough for her to meet the eyes in the gallery without flinching. And for the first time since she'd been dragged from that alley, she began to wonder if the story she'd been trapped in might not end the way everyone expected. When the recess was called, The courtroom slowly unraveled into small knots of conversation, the clink of coffee cups from the hallway and the hushed arguments of lawyers trying to salvage their schedules. But Ava stayed seated at the defense table, her hands wrapped around the edge like she might slide off the planet if she let go. Judge Ellison had disappeared through a side door, the black of his robe vanishing behind the frosted glass, leaving her with the echo of his voice and the strange steadiness it had given her. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, stepped over and muttered that she could wait in the holding room. But she shook her head, too aware that once she crossed back into those walls, she'd be just another inmate until someone decided otherwise. The public defender finally showed up. A woman in her 30s with a blazer a size too big and an armful of files she couldn't balance. "Ava Lennox?" she asked without looking up. Her tone clipped like she'd already decided who Ava was. "Yes," Ava said quietly, but the lawyer was already flipping through papers, her pen scratching out notes. "So, you were found trespassing behind the library. Any reason you want on record?" Ava hesitated, glancing toward the clerk who was gathering exhibits into a cardboard box. "The shelter was full," she said finally, "and the alley had a light. I feel safer when I can see." The lawyer didn't pause, didn't even ask the question that had been clawing at Ava's ribs since her arrest. Why no one had wondered how she'd ended up without a bed in the first place. "They say you resisted arrest." Ava looked down at her hands, remembering the cold bite of the cuffs, the officer's barked orders, and the way she'd twisted when they tried to pull her up by her arm that still ached from last winter's break. "I told them it hurt," she said, her voice flat. "They didn't like that." The lawyer sighed, scribbled something, and muttered about how the judge might be lenient if Ava promised to stay out of that neighborhood. "What about my things?" Ava asked, her gaze darting to the backpack on the floor. "What things?" "My notebook," she said, almost too soft to hear. "It's all I have left of my sister." The lawyer barely glanced up. "We'll see what we can do." It was then, through the glass of the judge's door, Ava saw him reappear, not with the slow deliberation of a man returning to routine, but with a purposeful stride that sent the clerk scrambling to catch up. He walked straight past the prosecutor, who tried to intercept him with a sheaf of papers, and stopped at their table. "Ms. Lennox," he said, ignoring the lawyer's startled blink, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" The defender bristled, as if this were against some unspoken code, but Judge Ellison's eyes didn't leave Ava's. She nodded. In the small conference room adjacent to Chambers, the noise of the courthouse dimmed, replaced by the muted hum of the radiator. The judge didn't sit. He leaned against the table, hands clasped loosely. "I'm not supposed to do this," he said, "but I can't pretend I didn't see the way you looked when those charges were read." Ava blinked. "How did I look?" "Like someone who's been punished for a long time without anyone asking why." The truth of it landed hard, cutting through the practiced numbness she'd worn for years. "They don't ask," she whispered. "No one does." His jaw tightened. "Then I'm asking. What happened before the library?" She told him, haltingly at first. The eviction notice slipped under the door 2 days after her catering job let her go. The shelters filling before she could find a bed. The winter storm rolling in early this year. She didn't mention the sister yet, or the notebook, or the way she'd counted her own breath in the dark just to stay awake. But his eyes didn't flinch, didn't flick to the clock, didn't sharpen with suspicion. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You have someone you trust?" She almost laughed. "No." He nodded slowly. "Then for now, you can trust me. We'll find a way through this." It wasn't a promise, she believed, not yet, but it was the first time in months someone had said "we" like she was worth standing beside. As they left the room, the weight of the trial pressed in again. But something else threaded through it now. The smallest thread of possibility, thin as spider silk, but unbroken. Ava clung to it as the bailiff called the court back into session. The trial was adjourned for the day with no verdict, only a muttered promise from the judge that there would be further review of circumstances. Ava stepped out into the courthouse steps, the pale winter sun glaring off the concrete, and the gust of wind cutting through her borrowed coat like it was paper. Her public defender had vanished into the swell of pedestrians, leaving Ava standing alone at the top of the stairs with the too light backpack she'd been allowed to keep. The notebook was still inside. She'd checked twice, but nothing else remained from the day she was arrested. No gloves, no scarf, no photograph of her sister that had once been tucked in the back pocket of the notebook. She pulled the zipper tight and started toward the shelter 3 blocks over, the one she'd been turned away from the night she was arrested. The street smelled faintly of exhaust and hot pretzels, the kind of city contrast that always made her dizzy. Warm food sold beside people with no place to sleep. When she reached the shelter, its double glass doors reflected her back at her in grim detail, hair uncombed since the courthouse holding cell, cheeks still marked with faint lines from the bench she'd slept on, eyes that had forgotten how to look expectant. Inside, the front desk was staffed by a volunteer in a knitted hat, his voice low and apologetic as he shook his head. "Full again," he said. "We've had people lining up since 6 this morning." Ava gripped the strap of her bag tighter. "There's a storm coming tonight." "I know," he said gently. "Try Street. Monica's on 9th. They sometimes hold a cot for emergencies." She'd tried Saint, Monica's before. The last time she'd waited 4 hours in the cold, only to be told the cot had been given to someone with a hospital discharge slip. Still, she nodded, because there was nothing else to do. Outside, the wind had picked up, flinging bits of litter against her boots. She headed toward 9th, her steps quick, her eyes on the cracks in the pavement to avoid the gaze of people who might see too much. Halfway there, a police cruiser slowed beside her, and her breath caught. But instead of stopping her, the passenger window rolled down, and a familiar voice called her name. Judge Ellison wasn't in the driver's seat, of course he wasn't, but the young officer who leaned out explained quickly, "Judge said if we saw you, to tell you not to risk St. Monica's. He left a note for you." She took the folded paper with numb fingers. In neat, precise handwriting, it read, "Meet me at the Municipal Outreach Office, 4th floor, 317 Main Street. Ask for Mr. Kavanaugh." No explanation, no instructions beyond that, just a location and a name. The officer nodded toward the end of the block. "It's that way. I'd hurry. Doors close at 5. The outreach office was in an old brick building that smelled faintly of floor polish and paper. The waiting area was warm but crowded, chairs lining the walls, everyone clutching forms or plastic bags of belongings. Behind the counter, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses looked up when she said the name. "Ah," he said, scanning a list. "Judge Ellison called ahead." He led her through a back hallway into a quieter office with mismatched furniture and a space heater humming in the corner. "He said you might need immediate placement," Kavanaugh continued, pulling a file from a drawer. "We've got a temporary room in a women's transitional house. Not a shelter, but there are rules. Curfew at 9, weekly job check-ins, no guests." Ava stared at him, unsure if she was hearing right. "I could have a room tonight?" "If you want it." She thought of the shelter's locked doors, the frost creeping over her sleeves at night, the way the city noises never really let her sleep. "Yes," she said finally. "I want it." Kavanaugh smiled faintly and handed her a key. "Room 3B. You'll share a kitchen with the others." "Welcome, Ms. Lennox." As she left the building, Key clutched tight. She knew this wasn't the end. Her charges still hung over her like a shadow. But for the first time in a long time, she wouldn't be sleeping with one eye open against the cold. Somewhere above her, the courthouse clock struck 5, and she wondered if Judge Ellison was still in his chambers, working late, making decisions that could alter lives with the smallest stroke of a pen. She didn't know why he'd chosen to help her, but she intended to find out. The women's transitional house stood on a quiet side street, a 3-story brick building with peeling white trim and a heavy oak door that seemed out of place against the neighborhood's tired storefronts. Ava hesitated before stepping inside, the key in her pocket feeling too substantial for what it promised. The foyer smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and coffee, a mix that was oddly comforting. A woman with cropped gray hair and a clipboard introduced herself as Marlene, the house manager, her voice brisk but not unkind. "Rules are simple," she said, leading Ava up a narrow staircase. "No drugs, no violence, no overnight guests. Keep your room clean, respect the kitchen schedule, and curfew is 9 sharp. Miss curfew twice and you're out." The hallway on the 2nd floor was lined with closed doors, muffled voices leaking from behind them. When Marlene unlocked 3B, Ava was greeted by a small space barely big enough for the twin bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. The bedspread was faded but clean, the dresser scarred with age, and the radiator clanged to life as if to welcome her. "It's yours for now," Marlene said, handing over a folded sheet with the kitchen timetable and chore list. "There's dinner at 6. Chilly tonight. You'll meet the others then." When the door clicked shut behind her, Ava sat on the bed, the mattress sagging slightly under her weight, and took a slow breath. It wasn't much, but it was hers. From the window she could see the tops of the bare trees swaying in the cold wind, their branches scratching faintly against the glass. She unpacked what little she had: the notebook, a pen, a change of clothes that didn't quite fit. The rest was just silence. At dinner, the communal kitchen was a buzz of clinking silverware and low conversation. 5 other women sat around the table, one with a toddler balanced on her knee, another with deep lines around her mouth that hinted at years of smoking and worry. Names were exchanged: Tina, Rosa, Jen, and 2 whose names Ava missed in the shuffle. She kept her eyes on her bowl of chili, the heat of it seeping into her hands as she cupped it close. The talk around her was a mix of shelter gossip and job leads, casual but edged with the weariness of people who'd been burned too many times. After dinner, she returned to her room and opened her notebook. She'd once been a meticulous writer: lists, observations, pieces of poems that never found endings. Now her handwriting was shaky, the words hesitant. She wrote down the date, the address of the house, and one line: "Today I got a key." The radiator hissed, and somewhere down the hall, a baby began to cry. Ava lay back on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, the sound of footsteps passing her door reminding her she wasn't alone here. She didn't sleep well that first night. The walls were thin, and every creak of the building made her tense. But she woke warm, and that was more than she'd had in months. In the morning, she found a note slid under her door. It was on heavy cream paper, folded once, with her name written in a hand she recognized immediately. Inside, in Judge Ellison's neat script, were just a few words: "We need to talk about your case. Noon, Courthouse Cafe." Ava read it twice, her pulse quickening. She didn't know why a judge would meet her outside official channels, and she didn't know if she should be wary or relieved. But she did know she couldn't refuse. She slipped the note into her notebook, dressed in her cleanest clothes, and headed out into the cold. The courthouse cafe was a small space tucked beside the lobby, its smell of burnt coffee and toasted bagels clinging to the air. Judge Ellison was already there, seated in the corner with a folder on the table in front of him. When she approached, he stood, not something judges did for defendants, and gestured for her to sit. "Ms. Lennox," he said, lowering his voice, "I've looked into your file. Something's not right." He slid the folder toward her, the edges of the pages worn from handling. "Your arresting officer's report doesn't match the security footage from the shop, and the store owner's statement changed between the night of your arrest and the hearing." Ava's stomach tightened. "So, what happens now?" He leaned forward. "What happens now is we find out why, and who wanted you off the street that night." Ava stared at the folder as if it might catch fire, the words the judge had just spoken echoing in her mind. The idea that someone had deliberately orchestrated her arrest was both terrifying and oddly validating. She hadn't been losing her mind all along. Someone had set her up. Judge Ellison tapped the folder lightly, drawing her attention back. "You told the public defender you didn't know anyone who'd want to harm you," he said, his voice steady but probing. "I need you to think harder. No one from your past? No disputes? No one you might have angered?" Ava thought of the years that had bled together on the streets. People came and went, names forgotten, grudges short-lived because survival took priority. But then, like a match striking in a dark room, a face came to her mind. "There was one man," she admitted slowly. "Darren Cly. He ran the shelter on 15th Street for a while. Said I was ungrateful when I didn't go along with certain things." She swallowed, the taste of old fear rising in her throat. "I left, and a week later, he told people I'd stolen from him. I thought it was just talk, but maybe—" Ellison's eyes sharpened. He flipped through the folder, pulling out a photocopy of a witness statement. He slid it across the table. At the bottom, under the store owner's signature, was a line: "Security provided by Cly Solutions." "That's his security company," Ava whispered, her hands curling into fists. "He's the one who put the cameras in that shop." The judge's mouth was a grim line. "And the one who likely had access to the footage before it was handed to police." He leaned back, studying her. "This changes things. But if I pursue it, it's going to get ugly. He'll know it's you who pointed me in his direction." Ava's pulse thudded in her ears. "You think I'm scared of him? I've been sleeping on concrete for 2 years. What else can he take from me?" Ellison's gaze softened, just slightly. "Your life, Ms. Lennox. Men like him don't play by courtroom rules." She knew he was right, but the thought of letting Darren get away with this made her stomach twist. She'd already lost so much: her job, her apartment, her dignity. This, at least, she could fight for. "Do it," she said finally, her voice firmer than she felt. "Find him out." He nodded once, gathering the papers. "Then I need you to be careful. Don't talk to anyone you don't trust. And if you see him or anyone connected to him, walk the other way. I'll handle the rest." When she left the cafe, the cold air slapped her cheeks, but she barely noticed. The street seemed sharper now, the faces of passers-by too clear, too curious. Back at the house, she found the hallway quiet, the hum of the radiator the only sound. She locked her door and sat on the bed, staring at the notebook. She wrote down Darren's name in bold letters, underlining it twice, as if that could strip him of the power he'd held over her. She didn't know what the judge planned to do, but she sensed the rules were shifting. And rules, she'd learned, were all that kept predators in check, or set them loose. That night, she dreamt of the shelter on 15th Street, its flickering hallway light, and Darren's shadow stretching too long against the wall. She woke with the taste of fear still in her mouth. but also with the sense that for the first time in years, someone else was in the fight with her. 2 days later, Ava felt the shift before she saw it. The shelter kitchen where she worked mornings had gone from the usual chatter and clatter to a stifling quiet. People were watching her. Too openly. Too long. The cook, Marla, didn't meet her eyes when she slid a tray of eggs across the counter. It was as if some invisible announcement had been made. Ava Lennox was trouble. She kept her head down, finishing her shift, but her pulse wouldn't slow. Outside, the air bit at her cheeks, a dry, brittle cold that turned every breath to smoke. She'd just rounded the corner toward the bus stop when she saw him. Darren Cly stood beside a black SUV at the curb, his posture relaxed but his eyes tracking her like a hawk sighting prey. He looked exactly the same. Thick build, expensive coat, smugness coiled around him like armor. "Ava!" he called, voice oily and bright enough to carry in the wind. She froze. Every instinct screamed to walk away, but she couldn't move. He strolled over, hands in his pockets. "Imagine my surprise, hearing you've been making allegations, to a judge no less." She swallowed hard. "Imagine my surprise, finding your name in my arrest file." His smile didn't falter, but something hard flickered in his gaze. "Careful, sweetheart. People who dig too deep sometimes fall into the hole themselves." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "And you don't have much further to fall, do you?" Before she could respond, a voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" Judge Ellison's tall frame appeared at the corner, his presence slicing the tension in half. Darren's expression cooled instantly, but he didn't step back. "Not at all," he said smoothly. "Just an old acquaintance, catching up." Ellison's eyes didn't leave him. "Acquaintances don't corner women on the street. Walk away." Darren's jaw twitched, but after a long beat, he did, sliding into the SUV and pulling away without looking back. Ellison turned to Ava, his voice lower now. "I told you to stay clear." She was still shaking. "I didn't go to him. He was waiting for me." He exhaled, scanning the street. "Then he's nervous, which means we're close to something." He glanced at her. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" She hesitated, thinking of the drafty shelter room with its thin lock. "Not really." He nodded once. "Pack what you need. You're staying in the courthouse apartment until this is over." It wasn't a question. That evening, Ava sat in a small but warm apartment tucked behind a locked hallway in the courthouse building, the faint hum of city traffic filtering through double-paned glass. Ellison had returned to his office, leaving her with tea and a stack of case files. She flipped one open, her own name staring back in black ink. The pages detailed every movement from the day of her arrest, down to the minute she stepped into that shop. Too precise. Too convenient. One page caught her eye. A note about an anonymous call made to the police that morning, reporting a woman matching Ava's description, casing the store. The call had come from a payphone near the old shelter on 15th Street. She felt the blood drain from her face. Darren wasn't just trying to scare her. He'd been watching her long before that day. And if he'd been watching then, maybe he was still watching now. The next morning, Ava woke to the muted clang of church bells somewhere beyond the courthouse walls. She'd barely slept, her mind running circles around that single page in the file. The payphone near the old shelter wasn't random. It was exactly where she used to stand in line for donated soup, where Darren had shown up more than once under the guise of helping the homeless for his PR campaigns. She dressed quickly and went to find Judge Ellison, who was already in his office, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up, scanning a stack of papers with the intensity of a man dismantling a puzzle. "There was an anonymous call to the police," she said without preamble. "From 15th Street, the day I was arrested." He looked up, brow furrowing. "And?" "That's where Darren used to appear. Hand out coffee, talk to the press. It was his territory." Ellison tapped the desk thoughtfully. "So he planted the story and made sure the police were there to catch you in the act. That means there's a record of the call." He reached for his phone. "We can subpoena it." Hours later, Ava sat in a dim conference room while Ellison spoke on the phone with a clerk, his voice calm but edged with authority. When he hung up, his expression told her everything. He had something. "The call wasn't anonymous," he said. "It was made using a prepaid cell registered under a shell company. Guess whose name is buried in the paperwork?" Her stomach tightened. "Darren. And that's not all. The shell company is connected to 2 other fraud cases currently under investigation." Ava sank into her chair, the reality settling like lead in her chest. "So I was bait. If the charges had stuck, no one would have looked at him." "Exactly," Ellison said. "You were the distraction while he moved money somewhere else." He leaned forward. "We can take this to the DA, but it's risky. Darren will know we're closing in, and people like him don't go quietly." Ava thought about the way Darren's eyes had bored into her the day before, the cold promise in his voice. "He already knows I'm not keeping quiet." Ellison studied her for a moment. "Then we control the narrative. Publicly." That afternoon, Ava stood beside him on the courthouse steps, a row of microphones pointed at their faces. Cameras clicked like insects as Ellison addressed the crowd. "The court has reason to believe a miscarriage of justice was attempted in this very building," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "A citizen's life was nearly destroyed by fabricated charges, orchestrated by an individual with a documented history of manipulation." He didn't name Darren, but the implication was a lit fuse. Ava's hands trembled at her sides, but when a reporter asked her to speak, she found her voice. "When you have nothing, people think they can take even more from you. But someone believed me when I said the truth was different. That's why I'm standing here, and why I won't stop until it's finished." Flashes went off. Questions shouted, but she kept her chin high. Somewhere in that crowd, she was sure Darren was watching, his empire starting to crack. That night, back in the courthouse apartment, she sat by the window, the city lights blurring against the glass. For the first time in years, she felt the tide turning. Not fast, not safe yet, but shifting in her favor. And she knew Darren would make his next move soon. The question was, would she be ready? The next 2 days felt like walking a tightrope over an unseen drop. Ava couldn't step outside without catching sight of someone she didn't recognize lingering too long. At the bus stop across from the courthouse, in the corner booth of the diner where she grabbed coffee, even once leaning against a lamppost near the church steps as she passed by. Whether they were Darren's people or her own paranoia didn't matter. The message was the same. "I'm watching you." Judge Ellison, sensing the tension, doubled the hours they spent together in his office, combing through every scrap of evidence they could link to Darren. They mapped out a timeline on the wall, connecting dots between his charitable appearances, sudden cash withdrawals, and the 2 fraud cases the DA's office had been quietly investigating. "If we can link his shell company to those fraud cases, and prove that same company funded the call that got you arrested," Ellison said, "it's not just your name cleared, it's a criminal conviction for him." But Ava could see the toll it was taking on him too. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and more than once she caught him staring at the wall as if measuring how far he could push before the system he served pushed back. Late that afternoon, an envelope slid under the door of his office. No name, no postage. Inside was a single photograph, Her, asleep in the courthouse apartment, taken from outside the window. Ava's stomach clenched. How? He wants you to feel unsafe, Ellison said, though his jaw was tight enough to crack. He's hoping you'll walk away before you get too close. She didn't. Instead, that night, she went with Ellison to the shelter she'd once called home, slipping in through the side door to meet a woman named Rosa, who'd run the kitchen for 20 years. Rosa remembered Darren. She remembered the way he'd smile for the cameras and then quietly tell staff to keep the messier people out of frame. She also remembered something else. One of his drivers had once bragged about delivering a package to a certain city official in exchange for forgetting a building violation on Darren's property. Rosa still had the name. By the next morning, Ellison had it in writing, signed and notarized. The DA's office, now officially involved, told them to be careful, but promised to pull the official's financials. Ava could feel the trap tightening. Not around her this time, but around Darren. She should have felt relief, but instead, a strange heaviness settled over her. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Darren wasn't working alone. He was part of something bigger, something that had tentacles in every corner of the city's bureaucracy. If we do this, she said quietly to Ellison that night, we're not just fighting him, we're fighting everyone who's been helping him. Ellison looked at her steadily. Then we make sure the first blow is loud enough that the rest think twice about swinging back. He poured them both coffee, the air between them charged with something unspoken, a mutual recognition that the next move would be dangerous, but it was theirs to make. Outside, the city's lights seemed sharper, the cold wind carrying a scent of snow. Ava wrapped her hands around the mug, steadying herself. Somewhere in that darkness, Darren was plotting his countermove, but for the first time since her arrest, she was plotting too, and she intended to make her move count. It started with a headline: Local business icon under scrutiny for fraud allegations. The article was careful, no names, no accusations, but the details were enough for anyone who knew Darren to put two and two together. Ava read it over Ellison's shoulder in his office, her pulse thudding with a mixture of satisfaction and fear. This will rattle him, Ellison said, his tone almost clinical. But it will also make him desperate? He was right. By that afternoon, Ava's phone, still a cheap prepaid one she'd bought after her arrest, buzzed with an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. You think you've won something. Darren's voice slid through the line, smooth as oil. But you're just making it worse for yourself. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Ava kept her tone steady. I'm dealing with the man who had me arrested for something I didn't do, and I'm not scared anymore. There was a long pause, then a soft laugh that made her skin crawl. Not yet, he said, and hung up. That evening, Ellison suggested they move her to a safer location, but Ava refused. If I run now, he'll take it as proof I can be scared off, she said. Still, she agreed to keep the courthouse apartment lights off at night and to vary her routine. The following day, they got their break. A junior investigator from the DA's office walked in with a file containing bank transfers, large sums moved from Darren's shell company to accounts tied to both the city official Rosa had named and another man under investigation in the fraud cases. The dates lined up perfectly with Ava's arrest and Darren's public appearances. This is enough to indict, the investigator said. But Ellison's eyes didn't light up the way Ava expected. Enough to indict, he repeated slowly, isn't the same as enough to convict. We need a witness. That's when Ava thought of Jamie. He'd been Darren's assistant for 2 years, the one who handed out bottled water to reporters during Darren's press conferences, the one who always avoided meeting Ava's eyes after her arrest. She tracked him down at a small coffee shop on the edge of the city. At first, Jamie denied everything, but when Ava mentioned that the DA's office was already building a case, something cracked. "I delivered the phone," he admitted in a low voice. "The one used to call the cops on you. Darren told me it was for a community concern. I didn't know until later." Ava leaned forward. "Will you say that under oath?" His hands shook around the coffee cup. "If I do, I'll need protection. You don't know what he's capable of." Ava glanced toward the window, where snow had begun to fall in fat, heavy flakes. "I think I do," she said. That night, back at the courthouse, she told Ellison everything. He listened, then nodded. If Jamie testifies, and the financial trail holds, Darren won't have anywhere to hide. But as Ava lay awake in the dark, the silence felt loaded, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The walls around Darren were closing in, but she couldn't shake the feeling that before they fell, he'd try to take something, or someone, down with him. The trial began under a sky the color of slate, the courthouse steps dusted with fresh snow that crunched beneath every footfall. Ava walked in beside Judge Ellison, her scarf wrapped tight, aware of the cluster of reporters who turned their cameras toward her. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of whispered speculation. Darren sat at the defense table in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression carved from stone. Only his eyes, betraying the flicker of recognition when they landed on her. The prosecution's opening statement was measured but pointed, painting a picture of calculated manipulation, fraudulent transfers, and the deliberate targeting of a woman who had no resources to fight back. When Jamie took the stand, Ava could see the tremor in his hands as he swore the oath. But as he spoke, detailing the delivery of the phone, the instructions from Darren, and the hush payments that followed, his voice grew steadier. "I didn't know at first," Jamie said, glancing toward Ava, "but when I did, I stayed quiet because I was scared. I'm not quiet anymore." The defense tried to dismantle him, pressing about memory, motives, and loyalty, but Jamie didn't waver. Rosa testified next, her eyes blazing as she recounted Darren's staged charity events and the whispered deals she overheard in the shelter kitchen. Each word chipped away at the image Darren had cultivated for years. Then came the financial records, displayed in cold black and white for the jury. Transfers, dates, signatures. Darren's attorney argued it was all circumstantial, that Darren had no control over the actions of his employees. But the DA's closing argument cut through. Coincidence does not sign checks. Coincidence does not arrange arrests. Coincidence does not buy silence. When the jury filed out to deliberate, Ava's knees felt weak. Ellison sat beside her, silent, his gaze fixed ahead. Minutes stretched into hours, the courthouse ticking like a slow clock. Then the buzzer rang. Verdict reached. The jurors returned, faces unreadable. "On the charge of fraud," the foreman said, "we find the defendant guilty." A breath Ava hadn't realized she'd been holding escaped her in a rush. "On the charge of malicious prosecution guilty." Darren's jaw tightened, his mask finally cracking. The judge, another, not Ellison, read the sentence. Prison time, fines, restitution. Darren didn't look at her as he was led away, but she felt the weight of his stare, as if promising this wasn't the end. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, the snow now glittering under a pale sun. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions, but Ava ignored them. She turned to Ellison, her voice low but steady. "It's over." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "For him, yes. For you, it's a beginning." For the first time in months, she believed him. And as she stepped down the courthouse steps, leaving footprints in the fresh snow, Ava realized the cold no longer bit at her skin. It only reminded her she was still here, and free. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on General Common Tales. If you were in Ava's place, facing the man who destroyed your life in court, would you have had the strength to see it through? Tell us in the comments.